So we talked about doing First Kings chapter 12, which I mean, this
Yeah.
is a pivotal story and an engaging story.
Yeah, pivotal to the Deuteronomistic history, pivotal to the rest of the book of Kings,
Mhm.
pivotal to ancient Israelite history. Obviously, the historian sees this moment as the moment that will define the rest of the history of Israel from this point forward.
Yeah.
It really is. It really is one of those defining moments in Israel. So
Yeah. Yeah. I found for me personally, especially when we have these really big books in the Old Testament trying to
yeah,
make sense of them and track what's going on, it's almost like it's helpful to have landmarks. So when you're telling someone how to get somewhere, hey, you're going to go here for, X number of miles, then you're going to
hmm
see this restaurant over here, or
hmm
you're going to see this tall building over here. I feel like this is one of the landmark points of the book of First and Second Kings, where I imagine, like in my mind, when I think about like the book of Kings as a whole, Solomon at the beginning is kind of the big one, and a lot of people are obviously familiar with Solomon. And then after Solomon, the next one is this story. It's Jeroboam and Rehoboam.
yeah,
That this is a landmark story that
yeah,
summarizes
yeah,
and illustrates a number of the key components.
yeah.
And there's obviously more. I'd be curious what landmarks you might put into it. But what's cool about this story is it kind of links in Josiah. So he's like that final landmark, I think, for the end of
It's
Second
good.
Kings. So it's
Yeah,
a way of almost
yeah.
bookmarking. If you know
hmm
Solomon, the Solomon narrative, and then from the rest of First to Second Kings, your bookends are Jeroboam, Rehoboam, and then the other end part is Josiah, and they link together and illustrate things. So I really
It's a
appreciate that.
great. That's a great thought. I mean, it's really nice that you're bringing that in there because really we have David, we have Solomon, and then we move into sort of this narrative of decline that just declines all the way up until Josiah, where we have this moment of repentance, this moment of well, it's really the explanatory moment of everything that's happened up to this point, right? It's you
Yeah.
find the book of the law, you find Deuteronomy, and suddenly it all makes sense as to why we are where we are, and now we can understand what's about to come. And it's quite interesting. But there's also another point because I think there's a connection here between Solomon. We're going to get into this between Solomon and his idolatry ultimately. Uh, and it's interesting too that his idolatry doesn't just come through the worship of images. It's really through various competing allegiances
Hmm.
with his covenant that he is to be keeping with the God of Israel, and the political allegiances that he's made with others in and around the land of Israel. That really is the key of the idolatry. But it's what the idolatry leads to ultimately with his son Rehoboam, and that I find to be quite interesting because we're not talking really about idolatry with Rehoboam. We're going to be talking about the way that he's treating other people and the way that
Hmm.
Solomon was treating other people. But that is really at the heart of idolatry as well. So
Is there anything you think that's maybe relevant or interesting for this piece of the conversation to talk about? Maybe what political allegiances in the ancient Near East worked, or that we
yeah,
know about kingdom, the annals of the kings, or anything.
yeah,
We don't have to
yeah.
go there if you don't have any
Well,
thoughts on this.
well, I mean, just in short, for our patrons, I mean, I think what's good to know is that the way that politics worked in the ancient world isn't so different than how politics works today, especially on a
Mm,
geopolitical level. What we
mm,
would say on an international level. I mean, at that time, we're talking a much smaller geographical area right there in the Near East, but these political entities like Israel, the Israelite kingdom, and the other people groups in and around Israel, they were making covenants, they were making treaties, they were giving political alliances with one another. You can think of Hiram in King Hiram
oh yeah.
in Second Samuel, right? Builds the palace for David, right? So this is a thing that happens in that particular story that's quite interesting as well. So there is these sorts of allegiances. What's really interesting is there was such a deep ethic, it seems, in the ancient Near Eastern cultures that when these treaties were breached, or these covenants, or these pacts were breached, it was a real ethical dilemma and something that
Mm,
was called to account. But
Yep.
on the flip side of that, if you were in agreement with a neighbor on some level, there was great reciprocity that was happening between the two, great business that was going on
Yep.
between, and one group was being faithful to another group, and very interesting on those levels. So, um, but here, what's most important, I think, and this is what I'd want to say, is that
Yep.
there's only one ancient society that actually had a covenant or a treaty with a deity.
Mm,
And in this
yep.
particular sense, it's Israel. So just as you're making political allegiances with people around you, you have to remember that you have one central political allegiance with the God of Israel, right? With the God of creation,
That's good.
and that must be supreme, and that becomes the issue here. So, and of course, religion and politics, all of that, there's no separation, right? I mean, this is all one sort of way of life in the ancient Near East. There's no way that we're picking these things apart. So,
Wow. That's gold. That's super good.
yeah,
One other small point I thought about as you were talking was the mutual benefit that kind of goes between the trade that where some of
yeah,
these happened.
yeah,
And you talk about
yeah.
temple. Think
Hmm.
about how part of the temple was the wood paneling inside the temple coming from Lebanon, I believe,
Hmm. Yeah,
or maybe from Hiram. To remember exactly who
yeah.
this is responsible for, but part of the key components within the temple itself are coming from a different people group because Israel doesn't have much wood. And so just another illustration of how
That's a
some of
great
this
point.
trade,
Yeah, the trade
started
and
out.
the trade routes were significant in and around Israel. Israel was the place, the land of Israel. I mean, was the place through which the trade routes would go for a lot of the ancient Near East, whether it be the Assyrians up north, or right with Phoenicians in the Lebanon area there that we
Yeah.
have coming down through Syro-Phoenicia and all of that. And to Egypt then, and all of those trade routes ran right through the
Let
land
me
of
ask you a
Israel. So very
question.
important. Yeah.
So I'd be curious how you would. So some people talk about Israel being it's like a backwater, you know, um, outer rim planet, using a Star Wars term there, but outer rim, Tatooine
Yeah.
type thing. It's like nobody's really interested in this place. It's super small compared to everything else around it, and the small part makes sense to me when you compare it to like the great Hittite Empire
Yeah.
or to what's going on in Mesopotamia or
Yeah.
Egypt. But when you talk about how this was a highway of trade, like what level of importance or relevance should we think about the land of Canaan and the land of Israel in this time? Do we think Israel's neighbors viewed them as like, when okay, we're expanding our empires, oh, we ran into this place, all right, I guess we'll conquer you too? Or was there a lot of intentionality by these other empires to say this place is very important because of how much it's a highway to trade? So I'm like, where do you think
Yeah.
it fits on
Yeah.
this?
Well, in the sense that it was a highway for trade, and the way that you could go down through the land of Israel to get either to Egypt and or to the south to Arabia, you're going down the backside there. Um, you, it was significant for the routes themselves, but oftentimes the empires would come through, and though they would conquer certain areas and certain city states, sometimes they would just pass through and they would move on. It wasn't
Mm,
anything that needed to be conquered, except when the peoples were getting in their way,
mm,
like what we see happen with the Neo-Assyrians in the Northern Kingdom. Eventually, that becomes a problem and a stronghold for it. So, I think on many levels it's both and. There were times in which it just seemed that the empires, whether it be really the Egyptians, had lots of control over the land of Canaan, and the Hittites were vying for that control. They also had a lot of political control. That would be at the late second millennium. So we're talking towards the end of the late Bronze Age. But when the Bronze Age collapses, then it's we see that Egypt declines in the land of Canaan. We have the rise of the Philistines, which would be maybe the sea peoples who came from the Mycenaean lands, and we have the Hittites disappear, and that gives way for the Neo-Assyrians, right? So the Assyrians start to come back into
mm.
power. They've been there the whole time, but they haven't had sort of the influence that these other kingdoms have had. And we see the rise of the Neo-Assyrians, and they start to have lots of control, it seems, over the land of Canaan. Of course, Egypt is still still there in the story. We have it in Kings. We have Egypt still having control in that particular area and vying for it in
In
many
fact, isn't that how
respects.
Josiah dies? Is he in battle with
That's right.
Egypt,
Yeah,
and he
yeah,
ends up
very
dying
good.
in
Yeah,
that in
and
that battle? So
there's always this discussion. Is Egypt going to come to our defense against the Neo-Assyrians, et
mm,
cetera, and so forth, that kind of thing, right? And of course, right in the midst of that is this call to faithfulness, to remember that it is not the powers that be who come to your defense. It is
mm,
the one who you are in political allegiance, to whom you are in political allegiance. It is the God of Israel himself who will come to your defense, right? So Israel's always in this. It's very interesting as a political entity. Israel's always in this moment of, do I trust in the powers that be? Do I see myself here in the natural, in the moment? And am I remembering that there is a God who's going to come to my defense in the midst of these politics and in the
mm.
midst of all of this that's going on? I find it to be a very, it's not a separation, it's a right in the middle of. And when you get to the prophets, which you start to get to in Kings, I mean, as we move a bit further, so suddenly we have Elijah and Elisha, and we have other prophets who show up at different times to speak to the powers of Israel, to the kings of Israel. I mean, and once you get there, you start to see that they start saying things like, "No, the God of Israel is behind all of this. Like he is interacting with each of these moves of the empires that be, or the stronger powers that be." And on behalf of Israel and for Israel, or to
Yeah,
punish Israel for their unfaithfulness, these sorts of things. So it's a murky area
yeah,
of discussion and theology. I don't know
yep.
that some of our political theologians today would like reading some of this. So.
Sure, but I think that's just important. I feel like you're giving an excellent summary, using different words, you could say, of the centrality of covenant, and
Mhm.
also we could say the idea of retribution within the Book of Kings. That this
Yeah.
isn't just a, like, look, I think we forget. Let's just, like, if someone just says, "Oh, the Book of Kings is
Mhm.
it's the history book of the kingdom of Israel."
All right.
Well, then we get into what is history. I love the
Mhm.
definition you gave me. I forget, maybe a couple
Yeah.
of years ago, where you talked
Yeah.
about, or go ahead.
Well, yeah. I mean, history essentially is humans reflecting on things that have happened in the past, but actually writing down in reflection of what has happened, of events that have happened in the past. I mean, that's what history is.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think anytime we do that, whether we think about our old history textbooks, uh, or any stories that we read, we understand that we can talk about World War II. You can listen to a
Hmm.
podcast about it, you can read books about it. But it's interesting. There's a difference between reading a school textbook that talks about World War II versus
Yeah.
a biography of a specific person in World War
Exactly.
II.
Yeah.
And honestly, if we are trying to, how do I put this? Maybe bias is the wrong word, but I'll just use that for now. Let's say someone's saying, "I want to have an absolutely zero bias, zero agenda, zero motive history retelling."
Hmm.
Like, first of all, it's gonna be very difficult, but all you can do is basically say names, dates, figures, places. But even then, which ones are you choosing to include or not include?
Yeah.
Then
Exactly.
ends up, so it's impossible to do it completely without it.
Yeah.
But it's like, even if you try really hard, you have
Yeah.
the app. First off, you have probably one of the most boring things you could ever read. Um,
Yeah.
I know there's a time and place to learn those types of things,
Hmm.
but ultimately, I think we're not just trying to answer the question of okay, this person lived here, this event happened at this place. What we're compelled by with history is, why did this
Yeah.
happen?
Right.
And what's the causation, what's the effect of this thing happening?
Yeah.
And so the author of Kings, the people who helped compose this, they're doing that same thing. And so the Book of Kings is not a boring book. It's not just, this person reigned for 40 years, this person
Right.
reigned for this many years, and that's all
Yeah.
that happened, the end. They're telling a story, and it seems one of the main points is about who is their allegiance to?
Right.
Is their allegiance indeed to the Lord? Are they indeed serving him, being faithful to him?
Hmm.
And the resounding answer
Exactly.
is no. In
Yeah.
fact, that's how the Book of Kings ends, is it
Yeah.
ends in exile. So you could almost
Mm.
wonder if you could say that one way of talking about the Book of Kings is, the Book of Kings is telling us the story of how we got into exile. And
Yep.
why are we in exile? It's because we were unfaithful
Yeah.
to Yahweh. We were unfaithful to him. Um, and they put a special emphasis on the kings.
Yeah.
So kings top all the way down.
It's a great point, and I think a lot of Christians and evangelicals can be a little worried about discussing it in this way because I don't know, when you're reading the text, you just assume that somebody was writing it at a very early moment, like just as it was happening. But the truth is that we have in the compiler of Kings, or the one who puts this together, says if you'd like to know more, you can go to this particular source here
Nice.
and you can read about it, right? So obviously somebody at a later time has compiled this from the sources, but they're doing something very specific. And I'm glad you brought this up. Whether you're doing a news report or whether you are doing history, you are bringing interpretation to the table. I mean, there's no way around it. We pick and choose what to emphasize in any given moment, and that's true in scholarship as much as it's true in the nightly news. Whatever it is, we pick and choose what we bring to the table. It doesn't mean that it's less true.
Yeah.
It just means that there is. You can just go with the facts and not bring narrative to the table, but there's still narrative even within the facts, and it's hard to get away from that. It really is.
That's a better concise way to put it.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I like the way you put it, but it's just true, and I think it's important. Even when you get in, the N.T. Wright has stuff on this that he talks a lot about narratives, so I like to bring him up with some of these discussions. But he makes a good point. Like even in something as complex as a scientific academic paper that's supposed to be very objective on a natural sense, right? Just observing what's happening in the natural order, there's still narrative running through it, and that's important to remember and to bring to this particular discussion. And with what we have here, the Deuteronomistic historian, the reason we like to call the compiler of these texts the Deuteronomistic historian is because, as you noted, we're getting to Josiah, we're getting to the destruction of the temple and the exile, and we need Deuteronomy to tell us why this is happening. And so, again, the structure of history, the hermeneutical principle of divine retribution, is right here in these texts as we move through. And I think what's important for us on a theological level as we dive into this is to note that God is there doing retribution in the moment. He's also there having mercy and not bringing down the retribution that is promised in Deuteronomy, right? Yeah. Because he's calling Israel to repentance, and he's waiting and he's waiting and he's waiting with patience. He's waiting until it's finally the moment. He says, that's it. I have to bring the retribution of the covenant down at this point. So,
well, that's a good point, because going from Deuteronomy to Kings, I don't know the exact number, but let's say, about 400 years, Book of Judges, about 400 years, the Book of Kings. Let's just call it an even 1,000, because we have other events going on too, like Samuel, Joshua. Between Deuteronomy and the exile, you have 1,000, let's call it 1,000 years of unfaithfulness to Yahweh. So it's not like a flippant,
Yeah,
literally.
That's good. He doesn't just destroy Jerusalem on the second year, right? I mean, this is the point, and I think it's easy for us to forget the time that passes when we're reading these ancient texts. And that is why, that's why the texts themselves emphasize so clearly that God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and right? They stress it to a fault that he is full of grace and love and mercy, because if you're thinking on a time level, he's been very gracious to us. We deserve this much sooner than we got it,
And even with the exile, I've been reading Ezekiel recently. Fascinating line where God speaks to Ezekiel, who is in the middle of an early wave exile of Judah, the Judean early wave exile. And one point, he gives it a word of encouragement to the other people in exile with him. While it seems the first temple is not destroyed yet at this point, or the temple's not destroyed yet at this point, but God says, I have been a little temple to you here in this exile. You have this Ezekiel God on wheels vision at the very beginning, that he's going into exile with them. It reminds me a lot about actually Genesis 3 and 4, where we talk about this idea of, now we're getting into your expertise, Water. So again, you add all your expertise here you want. But I guess to really simplify, often we talk about, Genesis 3 is a story where Adam and Eve sinned, and that sin caused separation from God.
Hmm.
Okay. So pretty typical. And sometimes the way we talk about that story is it's just total absolute separation. That's it.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, what's very interesting, Genesis 4, the very next chapter, what do we have? A story of God
Talking.
talking with
Yeah.
people. And
Yeah.
who of all people is he talking with? Cain, the
Right.
person, the person who is deeply struggling with some problems.
Yeah.
And by the way, God talks to him before he murders his brother. He tries to
Right.
get him on the right path,
Right.
tries to encourage him and guide him. And even though he doesn't, he still follows up with him. And so, wait a second, I thought we were separated from God. And I feel like
Exactly.
that's one of the wonderful dichotomies of the
Yeah.
Hebrew Bible is this idea of this I don't want to call it a push and pull, but it's just you have this two sides of a coin where on one
Right.
hand, yes, sin causes separation and there is evil to the people of Israel that God does not like. But on the same hand, he still pursues them. And
Correct.
how would you put this into words? This idea
No,
of your Bible?
well, I mean, I think you're Israel had a maintenance system, right? They had a way to maintain God's presence in their midst. It's called Leviticus, right? It's the whole
Oh,
Levitical system. The whole point is to clean and to cleanse the sancta, to make sure that God's tent, his house, his temple, all of it is clean because of Israel's impurities, so that God can remain dwelling in their midst. And I do think it's absolutely an evangelical mistake to only focus the gospel in that way of the separation between God and man, because it does in our post-enlightened, very naturalistic way of thinking. When we hear that, we think God's way up there somewhere and we're way down here, and He has no interaction with us. Where you know. The Jews don't even believe in, I mean, as far as the fall, right? They don't see it that way. And as the
yeah,
first sin is concerned, we've talked about this, the word sin doesn't appear till Genesis 4.
yeah,
So we know that there's
right.
a disobedience to a command thing that happens in Genesis 3, and I would stress that is a breaking of the covenant. Paul comes in and says this is the moment of sin. Adam sinned, all of that, of course. Um, but the point is that with the text, we have to remember that particular separation that happens between God and man, between humanity and the Lord. It sort of progresses, doesn't it? Because by the time you get to Abraham, Abraham can hear the voice of God and he can follow it. And God's appearing to Abraham in different moments. He's also appearing to others throughout Genesis. So there is still this interaction that's happening between humanity and between the Lord. But it isn't until we get, and I like to say to my students, Exodus 40 is that new Eden moment, right? That new moment when God is now dwelling in the midst of a people again. And the question is, can they sustain it? Adam couldn't sustain it, couldn't keep the command, and it drove him out of the garden away from the presence of God. Now the question is, they have the presence of God dwelling in their midst again. Can they sustain this marvelous thing that's happened? And what we find in Kings by the end is no, they can't. It's not possible because sin still needs to be dealt with on whatever that thing is of rejecting the Lord and his ways and being in rebellion to his politics, if you will, his way of ordering the world. Um, for whatever reason, that needs to be dealt with before humanity can have God dwelling in their midst. So
That's so good. Yeah, that's
it's a
powerful.
nice macro thinking there. So
Oh, but I mean, it's incredibly helpful
yeah.
to see
And
that.
hey, and for our listeners, just so they know, the reason, I mean, no one really knows why Cain's sacrifice wasn't accepted. The reason, we know the reason, right? The reason is he hated his brother, right? Jesus gets into this. He says, if you know that your brother or sister has something against you, he talks about this when he's talking about murder. He suddenly
Oh,
he suddenly switches and he says, if you come to the altar, leave your gift at the altar and first be reconciled with your, and then
oh
your
my.
gift will be accepted. So Jesus is given a full-on midrash of the Cain and Abel story. And it dawned on me one time, it's like, Cain already hated his brother. That's what's going on. And his sacrifice is not accepted for that reason. So
Where
okay. I got to
If you,
write this, or if
if
someone hasn't already, I don't know if someone has. So,
if the mic you had, wasn't so nice that we got you, I'd tell you to just pick it up and drop it. Right.
yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's fascinating to see how Jesus goes right back to that. It seems I think in his midrash of that moment. So,
Wow.
the Rosh is that? Yeah, the Rosh. Yeah. So,
Yeah, midrash the noun. Yeah, sure.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
midrash in it. That is so good. Holy,
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah, it's
wow.
very interesting.
Yep.
And we're sort of there in 1 Kings 12 on one level too, right? Because we're dealing with how one is treating their brother, how one is
Yep.
treating their neighbor,
Yes.
and in this case, how someone in authority is treating someone who's serving them, I guess you would say. So,
Yeah, and I think those two things go hand in hand. The faithfulness to the Lord almost
mhm.
always leads to it. It always leads to also treating brother, friend, and neighbor well, whereas not being faithful to the Lord always leads to the opposite. And I think that's why this idea of loving God and loving other people it's so often paired together. Um, I've
Exactly.
talked about this
Yeah.
with you about
Yeah.
uh, wisdom literature within Proverbs. We should do maybe a podcast on that at some point.
Yeah.
It's throughout the whole Hebrew Bible. So we see in First Kings chapter 12 that once Solomon's gone and Rehoboam, one of his sons, is taking over leadership, one of the problems is that some of the council, the people who were alive when
Mhm.
Solomon was reigning, they go to Rehoboam and they seem to have learned a lesson from how things went. They said, "Hey, Solomon, your dad, we realize in hindsight he was too intense and too harsh on the people with all these
Yeah.
work projects
Yeah.
and the taxation. And hey, if you will, by the way, I think this verse is an excellent one for,
You
the
want me to
really
throw it up?
popular
What is it?
servant. Yeah, let's see if we can find. It's a great verse for servant leadership.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Uh, let Let's see. It's early on. Okay, verse 4. 1 Kings 12, verse 4.
Okay. Let's bring it up here. Here we go.
And yeah, so let's see. I think I'm reading out the ESV. I don't know what you have, JPS. We can read from whatever. JPS, that sounds fun. We'll do
Yeah.
JPS
Let's
today.
do that. Yeah.
So verse 4, your father made our yoke heavy. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you.
Yeah. Amazing.
Or wait, okay. Sorry. So that's what the people say to Rehoboam. It's actually a little bit
Mhm.
later. So in verse 6, King Rehoboam took counsel with the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime.
Yeah.
He said, what answer do you advise me to give to this people? They answered him, if you will be a servant to those people today and serve them,
Yeah.
and if you respond to them with kind words, they will be your servant always.
Exactly.
But he ignored the advice that the elders gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him. I think there's so much to unpack here. First off, Solomon,
So good.
he is the picture. He is like the mount. He's on the Mount Rushmore of Hebrew Bible wisdom.
Yes, exactly.
He is. I mean, and so you have interestingly all this wisdom vocabulary going on here about getting counsel and advising, and we see his son is completely rejecting a path of wisdom, and instead of choosing wise counsel. Now this gets into Proverbs chapter 1. Right after the introduction in Proverbs 1, we instantly, right after the main speaker says, listen to the wisdom of your father and mother, and they're about to give them, hey, here's what the wisdom we're going to give you, and it's going to be about being faithful to the Lord and loving others, and gets into all that good stuff later. But they're right off the bat, the main speaker role plays as this criminal fool who's inviting the listener, come follow me, and we're going to be thieves and murderers together, and we'll have one pool of money that we'll share together. And it's interesting here that we have Rehoboam, who he decides to listen to these young people that he grew up with, as opposed to these wise elders, and it gets him into a lot of trouble.
Exactly. And I'm so happy you're bringing this up, because we often make such a distinction between what is the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, and we forget that these narrative texts are actually thinking deeply about wisdom, or whatever we mean by that, on one level. And I was just reading yesterday as I'm preparing to teach a class on wisdom in the ancient world for ORU next semester on Sumerian wisdom. And the author made a fascinating point, and I just stopped in my chair and thought, finally somebody has said it. There it is. And he said that he identifies two attitudes within ancient Sumerian wisdom literature, and he supposes the same is probably true for Mesopotamian and ancient Israelite. And these two attitudes are this. The first attitude is the father-son didactic poems, the one that say basically that the elders or the older generation has the wisdom that must be passed down to the next generation, and the sons and the children must submit to that wisdom. And that is the attitude of the first sort of style within the wisdom literature. The second attitude is a rejection of that. It's a pessimism towards it. It's basically challenging the ethical norms and the structure that exists, to call it to account and to put something else in its place. And I thought, now this is fascinating, because we have it right here in 1 Kings 12 as well, just as you're saying. The younger generation wants to challenge the wisdom of the elders.
Yeah.
And who is Rehoboam going to follow? That's the question.
Look, I think this is a great
I'm stepping into your area of expertise.
Oh, now, I know.
So.
What I love about the Sumerian wisdom literature is this is just a good point for people to realize that I guess maybe as history repeats itself, not the exact correct phrase here. It's just the value of history, realizing I think some people might imagine that the idea of progressivism is such a new idea, that everyone was a traditionalist. Right. And I'm using these in vague sense. I'm not just meaning, in only political senses, but in the very broadest of senses, everyone was a traditionalist until the Enlightenment. And then we had people who started challenging the ideas of those who came before. It's, people have been people, right? The people of the ancient Near East, these are people like us too. And so it's so interesting to see some excellent examples of the wisdom literature of ancient Sumer.
It's great. Yeah.
So we have this challenging, again, we have this in the Hebrew Bible as well, by the way, within wisdom literature, where we have some inner dialogue going on with some of these books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And seeing that in other ancient Near East places, I think is absolutely fascinating. And it's a good discussion to be had. It is.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess I was just going to dive us back into this
let's do
story here. So in this example, this story is not viewed as like hey, here's a good example of we need to make some updates and challenge the previous generation to view things differently. This is clearly viewed as a negative story because his friends give him some terrible advice. And
pretty bad.
It's pretty bad. Like they let's see, I think it's in verse 10. Let's see. I think it's in verse 10 where they say, and the young men who had grown up with answered, speak thus to the people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy. Now you make it lighter for us. Say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. I'm just going to let people read between the lines what that means.
Read between the lines.
Read between the lines. What they're saying to tell us. My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips, but I will flog you with scorpions.
Wow.
So he's not just going to continue what his dad did.
Yeah,
he's
exactly.
Take it to the next level.
Wow.
And so, basically you read on, and Rehoboam ends up saying what his friends had said. He doesn't say the locker room joke, the inappropriate locker room joke part, but he basically says, I'm going to flog you guys with scorpions. It's going to get even worse. So buckle up, Buttercup, because things are about to get even more tight and more heavy with taxation and with harsh work than my dad did.
Exactly, and I think that is the important point, because Solomon's kingdom was expansionary, right? I mean, it was really a time of great expansion in ancient Israel, both to the south and the north. But here we're finding the cost of that, and with any expansion moment, there's labor, physical labor that's involved in. Solomon obviously used heavy taxation on the north. and also used them for their labor. Now, remember, what was the whole story of Israel about in the first place? It was the
Yeah.
deliverance of the Hebrews under the bondage of slavery in Egypt, doing something similar to this. And here they are in
Yeah.
their covenanted land, in the land of inheritance. When you get into all that that means in light of the covenant, and we're going to find that the God of Israel does not stand on the side of the new progressive wisdom here,
Correct.
does he?
He doesn't. It's interesting you bring up Egypt, by the way, because we have one of the Hebrew word for taskmaster in Exodus describing
Ah,
some of the people that Pharaoh had put in leadership over the slaves,
that's
the Hebrew
excellent.
people.
Yeah.
And that word doesn't appear again until Solomon. And Solomon established taskmasters in his
Wow.
leadership. And so
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a sly connection to Solomon portraying him in a little bit of a wink kind of way
Yeah.
as the new Pharaoh. And he's become, this new person who's establishing such
Exactly.
harsh measures similar to Pharaoh.
Oh,
So
that's great. That's a great connection. Yeah.
one thing I think that's interesting, Jeroboam is a fascinating character to me.
Hmm.
The way that he's introduced, even I think, is he introduced at the very beginning? I guess Jeroboam is probably introduced in chapter 11, maybe. But anyway, I can't remember exactly which verse it's in, but he's introduced as someone who he worked during Solomon's lifetime.
Hmm.
And it seems he's someone who worked his way up into a management role. I think it's probably chapter 11. It's not going to be in
Yeah.
chapter 12.
Yeah. 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 You're right.
But he worked as,
We'll just leave it at that.
yeah, it's fine. I'll just summarize. Basically,
Yeah.
he ended up working his way up to a management role. But Solomon saw this guy and said, "Look at you, this person who he found favor in Solomon's eyes." It reminds me a little bit actually of King Saul seeing
Mm.
David,
Mm.
and he ends up putting him in a management role. What's ironic is this person that he sees favor in ends up becoming the one who, in a way, dethrones a significant portion of Solomon's kingdom by the
Wow.
time his son takes reign. Very similar to Saul, who sees favor in David finds favor in Saul's eyes, who ends up taking over leadership. Okay, so what's interesting is we have that Jeroboam is the son of Nevat, an Ephratite, an Ephraimite of Tzredah, and the name of his mother is Tzruah, which that's kind of interesting. I'll come back to that in a second.
Hmm.
But she is an Isha Almanah. She's a widow. And he was a Eved, a slave or servant, however you want to translate that, of Solomon. And what's interesting is that Tzruah is related to the Hebrew word for skin disease. And again, this gets in the whole why are people's names the names that they are.
Hmm.
And it's just the number of times where somehow it's connected is interesting. Not saying we know for sure, but it's like the way that this word is formed is it could be a name, or I wonder if this is an idea that his mother was someone who had a skin disease.
Yeah.
Either way, she's a widow. So Jeroboam grows up in a single mom home, and we know that he raises his hand up against the king. And so
Yeah.
he's the son of a widow who maybe had skin disease, not sure, might be reading into it. Uh, and he works hard, works his way up, becomes in management position, but he stands up for the people. He stands up against the unrighteous leadership style.
Mm.
And God sees this person and he says, I am going to work through you. It's actually kind of a cool story once we get to chapter 12, where this prophet basically, in a hooded cloak to disguise himself, walks down, grabs him, takes him to a back alley, and then tells him, hey, God's chosen you. You are going to lead 10 of the 12 tribes. He takes off his robe, tears it into 12 pieces, gives him 10 of them. You're going to lead the 10 tribes of Israel. God's
Right.
chosen you. And just be faithful to him. And there's your whole Deuteronomy thing again.
Yep.
Just remember the Lord. He's the one who's choosing you to be in leadership position,
Hmm.
and be faithful to him. And so Jeroboam, he's the one who speaks up against Rehoboam, trying to say, hey, lead differently. I think he has to flee to Egypt because of He's under potential attack.
Yep.
And but anyway, he ends up coming back and ends up taking over leadership in 10 of the 12 tribes, 10 of the 12.
Yep.
And just Judah and Benjamin. And God tells Jeroboam this, by the way, too, through the prophet, that because of my promise to David, I'm going to leave Judah and Benjamin and Jerusalem, the city, and that's going to stay there. So anyway, sorry, I'm kind of just rambling the story at this point.
It's good. Yeah.
There's just a lot of intrigue, I think, going on at this point. So
there is, and it shows. I mean, even that Solomon sought to put Jeroboam to death, right? I mean, that's why he flees to Egypt in the first place, is that Shlomo is coming after him, and he ends up in Egypt, and then we have this story with Rehoboam. But it is here with Rehoboam, because of following in his father's footsteps and doing what he does with the heavy taxation. The Lord already knows it. The prophet already knows it. That's why the prophet's already prophesying it, because of the worship that has happened with the northern tribes as well, worshiping the gods of the lands around the land of Canaan, or within the land of Canaan. And here, because of the heavy taxation and what Rehoboam does in this poor leadership decision that he makes in following wisdom that is not wisdom, right? But following the wisdom of his day with the younger group, God tears the kingdom away from him. It is the moment of the great schism that happens in this particular story. And we can't downplay this.
Yeah.
We can't downplay this, because it shows very clearly that God is very concerned with how leaders are treating those whom they should be serving on one level, but those who are under them in a sense, right? Those over whom they have authority. And the heavy taxation and the heavy corvée work that they were put under, God was extremely displeased with. It's interesting. It's so interesting too, with your focus on wisdom here, that the voice of wisdom had come, and all they had to do was follow it.
Correct. Yeah. Speaking of the voice of wisdom, so interesting. In Proverbs, you have wisdom is even personified, and wisdom speaks in chapter 2. Wisdom, she speaks like a prophet. And when I say like a prophet, we're talking very similar Hebrew language construction. And this is not just me commenting on this. You can look at a number of commentaries. They'll point this out, that when she goes out to the city gates and when she speaks in the places of the city that prophets would speak in, at least according to the Hebrew Bible, how they would depict where they might go and deliver their messages. And the vocabulary she uses, the manners in which she speaks, very much like a prophet, and challenging these people and saying, you're choosing an evil path, and the people who've taken this, they're going to eat the fruit of their way. What's fascinating toward the end of Proverbs chapter 9, where we have wisdom is speaking and her antithesis is speaking, this woman of folly. What's fascinating is they both are inviting people into their house. And where are their houses? Both of their houses are on the highest point of the city. And I remember a commentator mentioning this, is in the ancient Near East, what is built on the highest point of the city? The temple.
Yeah, the temple.
And so it's
called a house. I mean, that's the other thing, right? It is a house.
Good point. So you're right. Yes, the word temple is also just called the house of the Lord, right? Being the temple. So they're inviting into these houses. So the picture is, you have on this mountain, you have these two houses, if you will, or two temples. And so wisdom is inviting you into the temple of the Lord, whereas her antithesis, this woman of folly, is inviting you into a different temple of just anything that's but the Lord. So some sort of, other, just any anti-God temple, just whatever. Yeah. And so, it is, what's at stake with wisdom is it's not just how much money do I have or not. Like, what's at stake with wisdom is also this whole faithfulness to the Lord.
Exactly.
And so we see this in this story, like you said, with as bad as the taxation and the heavy corvée work, it's not just that's at stake. This is about the mistreatment of the Lord's people, because ultimately he is the king of Israel and he cares for his people. And so them abandoning that way of wisdom it's a direct affront against the actual king to whom they should have their political allegiance. And so that's where wisdom conversation in the Hebrew Bible are trying to assist in this movement of guidance toward the one true God, and walking in his ways in every
Yeah,
aspect of life.
exactly. That's so good. I mean, that is such a nice overview of wisdom, and it really brings together, because we often see, again, such a separation between what we call wisdom sort of in the Bible and the
Mm,
other texts. And
yeah.
as you've shown in your research, and as you've shown in your study so astutely, that the truth is, it's all reflecting back on really God's Torah in many sense, that this is
Yeah.
his wisdom, right? And um I think here in this particular story, we see the connection between idolatry and the way that people are treated.
Yes.
And I think we there's a good maxim that comes from this. There's just sort of a good wisdom nugget that we can take, and that is that idolatry will lead to the oppression of people. It always does. And you can see why the
Mm,
worship of false gods, the worship of the self, ultimately why this is so problematic is
yeah.
because it will bring you to a place in which you do not love your neighbor. You know,
Absolutely, that and that direct connection. And that goes back to Jesus again. When he's
it
asked what's
does.
the greatest commandment, he ties them both
Yeah,
together.
yeah.
As I mentioned this before, in Proverbs 1 through 9, they define wisdom as Yirat Adonai, fear of Yahweh,
Hmm.
and Tzedek Mishpat Umesharim, righteousness, justice, and fairness. And so you have, I think the Hebrew Bible throughout is continually tying these together. The prophets, what are they doing? It's they're constantly pointing out both the idolatry and the violence. And
Exactly.
they point out both constantly. This is a good story for it. The second half of this First Kings 12 is fascinating. That might be a good time, maybe for our next month Bible study. We can get into that because speaking of
Okay.
idolatry, this
Yeah.
story goes in a really interesting way. So we'll chat about it. We'll see where we go. But it's uh, this whole chapter, where this goes, is such a shocker to me, because I
Mm,
think when we look at Jeroboam as a character, he's I think he's very likable. He is somebody
exactly.
who wouldn't want to root for him. Again,
Yeah.
single mom home, hard worker, stands up for the people multiple times, to the point where he has to flee because he is being chased down by the king himself.
Yeah.
And when God chooses him, it's like oh, that makes sense. I
Yeah.
see why God's choosing him. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, God chooses who he's going to choose, and he's going to work in his ways. Not because anyone's perfect, but it's like, you know what? This new kingdom could be set up well, because
Yeah.
this person didn't seem to have bad ulterior motives. Maybe end on this note real quick. I forgot the meaning of
Mm.
the names of these two guys.
Oh yeah.
Jeroboam,
Yeah.
Rehoboam
Yeah.
sound
Yeah.
really similar.
That's good.
So what's interesting is, so again, I'll make sure I get the vowels right. So we have Yarovam. I can't remember if it's a Rehovam or Rachovam. Where's Rehoboam? Do you have a verse? Oh, Rehoboam verse 1. Let's see. Rechavam. Yes, that first vowel is short. So anyway, Rechavam, both of their names end with Ein Mem, which means people. And then we have Rachav at the beginning, which means to make wide. And so we could figure out how we would interpret that. Could this be like a Rechavam? It's like a making wide, an expanding of the people,
Mm.
perhaps. Now, how that plays into the story is the one I'm less sure on, how it
Hmm.
could play into a factor. But either way, Rehoboam is such an ironic, painful character, and what he chooses to do. He
Yeah.
doesn't expand the people; he expands the taxes. And so, what's more interesting though is Yarovam, which we have again Am being people, and then Yarav at the beginning could be a play on the word Yariv. Yarovam Yariv, which means to
Interesting.
take up a case, to take up
Yeah.
a cause.
That's
So
interesting.
we see like the word Ariv appearing in the prophets
Mm.
many times, where God says, I have a case against you,
Yeah.
Ariv against you.
I
And
see where you're going.
so what's interesting is, obviously we see Jeroboam, one of the things that he does is he pleads the case of the people
Mm.
before Rehoboam. And so
Yeah.
it's just interesting
It's
that
a
he does.
It's amazing. I mean, it's all right there. Wisdom, retribution, judgment, it's all intertwined, even in the names potentially, right? Or you could
Yeah.
even say Rechav. I mean, you could go with he does widen the people. I mean, they become two distinct kingdoms, don't they? I mean, you have the northern
Oh,
and the southern
sure.
tribes, right? There's a widening that really happens there,
So yeah, I try to be careful with names, especially
opposed to
when
a narrowing.
the names aren't explained. But sometimes
Yeah,
it's just hard to not see a
yeah,
potential connection. I'm like, what are the chances? Like,
Yeah.
what's going on here?
Yeah.
Like, I don't.
It's fun to do. I think it's good practice. I think it's fun to do. You have to just leave it at, well, we don't know, but it's nice, So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So
So
we, there's a potential fun fact, but it's not precise.
I like
Okay,
it.
so this has been really fun.